This is Chairman Hoyt Prindle. I will call this meeting of the Subcommittee on Racial Discrimination and Equity to order now that it's 5:31 p.m. on June 23rd. Just briefly, I'd like to thank everyone who has participated or who volunteered to participate in this committee. I look forward to a fruitful and vigorous discussion that hopefully produces a good product, which we can be happy with, the full CAC can be happy with, and ultimately the MPO can be happy with and support. So with that said, I understand we have one person on the call for public comment, Ms. White, so I'll go ahead and turn over to her for public comment.
I don't have anything right at this moment.
Okay, well, as we're going through this, if you decide that you need to chime in about something, just try to let me know, and we'll get you an opportunity to comment.
I sure will. Thank you.
Thank you. So just looking at our agenda, I guess the first place to start is circling back to the last meeting with the revisions by Cliff and Dana. My original draft, and again, I want to thank Cliff for being a very good proofreader of my non-proofread resolution that was drafted. And so I guess to start here, I think from my perspective, I don't have any disagreement with any of these particular changes, with the exception of I do think it's important that we emphasize racism's effect on the African American community, given that, well, just given the history of this country, history within Tampa, and what's happened over the past 4 to 6 weeks. You know, while certainly I agree that we can try to clarify that, yes, that road clearing and slum clearing to build freeways has impacted all kinds of minority communities. But I do think it's important to emphasize specifically the effect on the African American community, especially given the history in Tampa. And I think Dana's pretty aware of what the history is, but I don't know how aware everybody is that, you know, essentially 275 kind of destroyed the African American business district here. That was based along Central Avenue and to the north of downtown, and that is completely gone due to the building of the freeway. So that's kind of why, for a very variety of reasons, I chose to emphasize you know, ensuring that African Americans and the discrimination they face were front and center in this resolution. But with that said, I'd like to turn it over to some of our committee members for comment.
Oh, go ahead, Cliff.
I don't disagree with anything you've said. I agree that using the recent events affecting the African American community is a good jumping off point. I just think it is important because this resolution will be around for a long time, that if we use the African American community as a starting point, ultimately we broaden the final paragraph to be more inclusive, because it will, you know, the transportation impacts a lot more than just the African Americans. It's all of the disadvantaged communities. So start where we are, bring in the transportation piece in the middle paragraph, kind of as has been done. But my suggestion is the closing paragraph should be broader so that it has an effect not just this year and next year, but several years out, because once this is, you know, in there in public record, it's going to have a life of its own.
I can't.
I think I would.
Oh, I'm sorry. Is that David?
Yeah. I'm sorry, guys.
David, go ahead.
Okay.
lone African American committee member, certainly I'd like to hear from you.
Well, yeah, I definitely agree with you, Hoyt, that definitely the focus should be on the African American community. I think we also, I would like something added to the effect of how going forward, I think the whole document kind of lays this out, but what I like are specifics and how we could go forward and making sure that we do include policies, or when we're thinking of different transportation issues, that we have African American or low-income areas or minority areas in mind. And maybe there's a something that we can say to that effect that will give people some type of just make people feel comfortable in knowing that they can trust us making these decisions. As you pointed out, you're correct. It destroyed the economic piece or the economic in the African American community when 275 was built. So I see a lot of that, or I've seen, and he's spoken to me about a lot of what happened back then, and how the interstate kind of changed the African American community. So if we can speak or somehow keep that in there, or put that theme in there, I would think that would be helpful, and then point to the African American community that not only says, hey, we're out here, we appreciate and we're going to strive to do better, but and making a point to do better with our decisions and things like that. So, but as far as what's said in the document, I agree with Cliff's changes and pretty much most of Dana. So just had to put my 2 cents in that. I do appreciate the African American. Sorry, keeping that in.
Hey, this is Christine. I'd like to say a couple things.
Yes, just 1 second, Christine.
Sure.
I just want to check. Did anybody? Was David's feed clear with everybody else? I was having some feedback or breakage, and I just want to make sure.
No, he was breaking up, and he was also moving quite a bit his screen, so it was a challenge to hear him. I don't know if it's internet connection. It may be where he's located in his home that's causing him to break up and pixelate his picture.
Okay, so
Now,
David, just before we move on, because I want to make sure that I'm accurately surmising what you stated with a little bit of the fading in and out. But as I kind of understood it, you're okay with the changes that Dana and Cliff has made. You want to keep the emphasis on African American history in dealing with racism, and as I understood it, maybe strengthen perhaps with some of the history, specifically in Tampa and Central Avenue. I think you were saying you talked with your father. I couldn't really hear, but I just wanted maybe just take a second to clarify on that, so I'm understanding where you'd like to see us go forward.
now we can't hear him.
Yeah, David, you're on mute if you wouldn't mind unmuting.
Can you guys hear me okay now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the main point, Hoyt, thank you for that. Yes, that is much of the point that I was making. Just strengthening up the language to show the African American community where we're coming from, where our policies are coming from, and to give them confidence that, hey, we are no longer making policies to destroy the African American community. We are hopefully the policies moving forward, or the opinions moving forward, will keep them in mind. And I was just commenting on your point, Hoyt, about the of how the 275 destroyed commerce piece or the African American community from a commerce perspective with Central Avenue. Yes, my father is from here, raised here, and I've spoken to him a lot about how 275 kind of changed the community. So I agree with Cliff's changes. I agree with most of Dana's changes. I would like to see that we focus more on saying what and how we're going to, move forward. And that was pretty much my piece, just to sum it up, because I don't want to take any more time. I apologize for the issues, the technical issues.
Okay, thank you, David. I appreciate that and appreciate the clarification. So I believe Dana wanted to chime in. I'm gonna shift to her. Dana, if you'd like to go ahead.
Thank you. I wanted to make sure, Hoyt, that you knew that at our last CAC meeting, I wasn't trying to derail this at all. I kind of felt, I was really glad that at the end you said, can we at least pass something to say that we support the spirit of the resolution? Because I did feel like it was an urgent issue that we should at least say we recognize that there's a problem within the transportation, planning system. And I kind of felt like our chair didn't really give us the time to, there were a few times I wanted to speak up and say that at the CAC meeting, but I kept feeling cut off. So it just kind of rolled because it was a very busy meeting. So anyways, I just want to make sure you know that, because I kind of felt like maybe you were frustrated or something, or that I was intentionally trying to derail it, and I was not. So that being said, like, as I mentioned actually before, this is kind of like my life's work, is studying racism and discrimination and racial inequality and disadvantaged communities in the transportation system throughout history. So, it wasn't just I-275, it was I-4. It was taking away the 40th Street exit in East Tampa. It's the continued conversation about removing the Flora-Braska exit. There's just so much, like literally our entire transportation system was built on racism. Like, so that being said, it's a tricky topic, because we can pass this resolution that says at this point in history, we can't be silent anymore. We have to recognize that our systems were built on racism and our systems have to change. And we vow to do that somehow. I mean, the amount of changes that have to happen is a lot from just based on my research. So I guess what I'm trying to say, I definitely want to say that I incorporated Cliff's edits in my edits. So every time people say that they accept Cliff's edits or they accept mine, it's like mine include his. I'm also curious, like, what exactly people don't like about my edits, because I put a lot of thought into them. I have my like whole like past 5 years of research that I did to come to like an understanding when I'm proposing things. And I explained my rationale like in a pretty detailed way. So I feel like what I ended up with Hoyt's resolution to start with, and then using Cliff's suggestions, and then just kind of tweaking it a little bit, what we ended up with is, I feel like a very succinct kind of like moment in time resolution of, it starts with, at this moment in time, there's been excessive, this George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, to be specific, are signaling that a change needs to be made. That's the first paragraph. And then the second paragraph is specifically transportation needs to change. And then listing those things like I-275, I-4, the Interstate and Defense Act of 1956. You know, like there's so many things we could name, and that's fine. So that's like a little like, oh yeah, we've done some research. We know that transportation must change for these reasons. And then the final paragraph is, you know, we, the CAC, stand with those who peacefully protest for racial justice. That's perfect. That's beautiful. And, you know, we adopt this resolution to ensure that transportation disadvantaged people are paid more attention to, which, I mean, that's one way of going about it, but I do think that's a valid way of going about it. So that being said, that is, if anybody wants to like ask specific things about the specific resolution, or has a different idea of what the resolution should say thematically, I feel like that would make this a productive conversation. That's all.
Okay, thank you, Dana. And just to comment, I didn't take any offense to our discussion at the last meeting, or you know, wasn't frustrated by anything. In Chairman Roberts' defense, we had quite the full plate with the tip and everything else. That even despite our robust discussion, went well over an hour over. So perfectly fine, and appreciate the input, and glad that Chairman Roberts gave us the opportunity to come together as a group here to kind of hash this out and create hopefully a more perfect product that we can put forward to the full CAC and the MPO. Before I comment again, I believe Christine, and I'm sorry if I interrupted because we're having the difficulties with David's audio, but I believe Christine had a comment that she wanted to make as well. Christine, are you there?
Yes, thank you. I want to thank everybody that's put so much time and energy into this. And Dana, I can really see that you are extremely familiar with this subject, and it shows. So thank you for that. I like what you have written and the incorporation of Cliff's body of work also. I'd like to suggest, and I can send this to, I don't have a Wi-Fi connection right now, but I can send it to you. I'd like to introduce our statement with a sentence that explains that our goal as a CAC is to represent all citizens of Hillsborough County, but especially those whose voices have been missing from the transportation and land use planning process due to historical disenfranchisement resulting from racism and poverty. So kind of just remind any and all readers that this is what we signed on to do. We are the Citizens Advisory Committee, and so we are committed to representing all citizens, and in this effort, especially those that have been historically disenfranchised because of race and poverty. So I have that to contribute. If you all agree, we should have sort of an introductory sentence. I have a couple of little wordsmithing things, but in the general gist of it, I feel that we should incorporate transportation and land use because both hand in hand are have been very, very damaging to our African American and disadvantaged communities. And so I just would like to see land use incorporated in the language. And I think that to David's point, we want to focus primarily on our Black constituents right now to make our message very clear. But I think we also, not far behind and possibly included in this language would be the people that are poor. Often, they're one and the same person. They're targeted for transportation infractions but then can't get out of the vicious cycle because of being poor. So I think that those elements, I'd like to see them put forth in the document too. That's all the feedback I have right now.
Thank you, Christine. And just a reminder to everybody, if you wouldn't mind, when not speaking, make sure to please mute your mic. It just helps with some of the feedback that comes in when sounds that are outside of your control maybe happen in the background. So, Rich, do you mind putting the agenda back up for me one more time? I know it's very brief, but that would just be helpful. I want to make sure I'm not getting ahead of myself here as we move forward. Okay, thank you. Before we move on, I'll just ask, because again, we have one member of the public. Ms. White, just checking in with you if you have any comment on the discussion here at this time.
Yes, back where I think what we have to do, and I'm one of those that lives in East Tampa, and I too come from a family that's a first, having a mother that worked for the Parks Department that with Herman Massey and with the palm trees and all the planning of that went on in Tampa. Also, father was a doctor. My home is 100 years old, and it's on the historical registry. And everybody, we keep saying poor and disadvantaged. Everybody that's in East Tampa is not poor and disadvantaged, but we would like to see that word possibly taken out of. I am across I-4. I'm a part of the neighborhoods that have been destroyed, but we have got to form better partnerships with the state and the city, in my opinion, because I've been at those meetings when there's been transportation, and the damage has already been done where they have talked about closing off Florabraska. They talked about moving over there where the Ella apartments are or units are. They talked about moving the basketball courts underneath I-4. They destroyed over there where I call it Malfunction Junction. So a lot of these decisions and permits have already been made as to when it comes down to neighborhoods. And at this point in time, the neighborhoods are pretty much gone and decisions have been made. We've got to do better with that. It's great to have studies and things like that. I appreciate the work that the young lady has put into it, but we need to talk to or get more involved or find out more about how our citizens feel about what's really taking place in the neighborhood when it comes down to transportation. They may be poor, but they may not have a car, or they may decide that they don't want a car. They would rather use public transportation. When you go to the train station, the decision has already been made. The permits have been made for the, I can't think of the name of it, to go from Orlando to here, the speed train.
The Bright Line?
Yeah, those permits and things have already been done. So there's a lot of things that we need to really, as much as I can determine from these different meetings, that we need to get way, way ahead of and be more proactive in the terminology as we're trying to use and put together some type of policy and procedure. That's it.
Okay, thank you, Ms. White, for your feedback on that. Since it's, I saw David's screen come on. David, did you have a remark or just checking in?
Yeah, and just to add on to her, Ms. White's point, that's a little bit what I mean about making a pledge to do better and strengthening up the language. When we talk about, I looked through Rich's document about that he sent in addition to the agenda that was sent out. And a lot of that says exactly what Ms. White's point was speaking to, is that when, and what I want to add into this is that we're pledging to do better. By doing better, I mean, we will reach out and use media that African Americans use. just so that we can make sure that they have some equity in whatever decisions that are being made. That is what I meant by strengthening up the language. To say all this is well and good, I mean, everybody here has intentions are good, but we want to. I want to see it strengthened in a pledge of some sort that says, "Hey, look, we will make sure we do our best," and reaching out to Black media outlets, making sure that the buy-ins from the African American community is there, and provide some type of KPI that shows, hey, look, this is the buy-in from the African American community when this decision was made. I think that's important to show to the people, to the African American community. That's what I think we want to see. Reach out to us, let us be part of the decision-making process, and then, you know, let's see the proof. Hey, this is what we did to reach out to the communication community because we had this many participants. So that's what I meant by strengthening up the language and sort of making a pledge. I just wanted to clarify that as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, David, for that feedback. So I think, and I might bring Rich in here for a second, just to kind of guide us in this direction. So I know a couple different people have mentioned land use, and that's an important part, obviously, of any urban development plan. Rich, maybe you can provide some guidance here. My general thought is that, and I know that we talk about transportation in the context of how poor transportation choices affect land use even outside of the specific transportation. But I want to make sure as we, come to an agreement on drafting a resolution here, just that part of my concern is that if we drift too much into the land use category, that for the purposes of the MPO, we might be broadening the resolution too much where we wouldn't be able to get the MPO support because it would be kind of outside the scope of the MPO's mission, if that makes sense the way I'm trying to communicate it. So, Rich, maybe you could just chime in on that. I mean, I certainly think land use is important. I certainly think about it, but I wonder if we go down in the land use realm too much, if we're getting outside the area of where the MPO could commit to something.
Yeah, hi. Rich Clarendon. I know the members on the CAC know you, but know me. But just for Ms. White's information, I'm the staff to the Citizens Advisory Committee and the Assistant Director of the Metropolitan Planning Organization for Transportation. That's part of our mission is longer range transportation planning. But I think Christine is correct that land use planning and transportation go hand in hand. If I might make a suggestion that would affect both, for both the formatting and sort of the language of the resolution, and maybe would allow for inclusion of land use, resolutions that are adopted by the MPO sort of follow a very traditional format that a lot of governments use, where they start out with some whereases clauses, which basically state the case. What is it that's a problem or needs to be improved, and then wind up with the actual resolution language, which usually starts with something like, now therefore be it resolved that, fill in the blank. And so I think that, in the whereases provisions that are, before you get to the resolution, you could certainly point out that, some of the sins of the past really have to do with land use planning, or just, plans that are made for communities that haven't always been for the best. So I don't think that's inappropriate. I do think you're right, though, Mr. Chairman, that the MPO's purview really, doesn't take. We don't have land use control. That's the bottom line. So I think it's appropriate maybe to point it out. I don't think there's much we can do in terms of specific actions, other than to point out, where we think that, land use decisions, hopefully in the past, that have been made in the past, have been damaging. So that would be my suggestion.
Thank you, Rich. I knew I could count on you to come up with a great solution to this problem. I'm sorry. Yeah, yes, I believe that's Ms. White wanting to chime in. Please go ahead.
It's me, if that's okay with the
Sorry,
members and Rich.
W, and then I see your photo. So apologize.
Okay, it's okay. Rich, first of all, can you go down to the first resolution page for me? A couple of things, and I really appreciate all your comments and where everyone's heart is. Yes.
Since some of the members joined after you came on, why don't you just go ahead and introduce yourself again?
Oh, I am public relations strategist for the Plan Hillsborough organization, which not only represents the MPO, but also the Planning Commission and the Hillsborough River Board. And I've been looking a lot at this very heartfelt topic, and I almost see there's a couple of, I'm going to go in a couple different directions. Number one, instead of, I think we can turn around what we say, what you guys decide to say, as that moving forward to better coordinate with land use planning, our coordinated partners and land use planning to ensure that this type of pattern won't be repeated. Things like that, where you're inferring the same thing. I think the beginning paragraph should almost be an introduction that you say that's not necessarily part of this, and just talk about transportation, because the specific cases that are cited here has called the country to action, certainly, but it's about police brutality, which unfortunately we have zero control over, but we do have control over how things rear their head in transportation planning. But that's just a thought. To a lot of what David said, and also Ms. White, I really appreciate Ms. White's comments, and there will be programs forthcoming where we actually want to listen to the community, and we'll go out there. But just want to prepare for this, and hoping to meet in person with people and not have to do really build relationships with the community over webinar, because if you don't know the people, it's not as friendly as we can all meet face to face and really listen to the community, because it's not really that the communities need to be told what to do. They just need access to resources so that they can decide what's best for themselves. And so I worry a lot about marginalized language, like words like minorities, communities of concern, disadvantaged, because there's nothing wrong with a single person in any of these communities. What's wrong is that they've been underserved and have been victims of the racism in the past and things like that. So I think we have to look at every word, because what's a minority in terms of percentage in America might be the majority in the neighborhood. And so any term that could be demeaning or say that any person is less than and does not have equal value, I think should be removed and replaced with a positive term or a term that describes, you know, the neighborhood situation of being underserved with these resources versus the people are not anything wrong with the people. So, so that's part of squelching the racism, is to say that is to change how we speak. And, you know, and later as we include other, whether it's ethnic groups or pride groups or whatever, you know, and however we're doing business, it's the same thing. We're all human beings and should be treated with respect and dignity. So I think the heart is there. I just want everyone to be careful and just look at every word that we say. And I appreciate you listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. The lawyer in me especially appreciates the focus on specific words. With that said, I know Dana probably has some feedback, given that I know a couple of those provisions were hers specifically. So Dana, would you like to go ahead, please?
Thanks. The what I'm seeing is the sentence, where is it? We want to work towards more robust access of transportation to all modes of transportation with a more intentional focus on the needs of disadvantaged communities in Hillsborough County, or historically disadvantaged communities. My whole thing is, I just want to make sure the language is very tricky, because the fact of the matter is the racism and discrimination was not like an accident. It was very intentional. People weren't just discriminated against their lack of power and the fact that like their communities were intentionally devalued is what allowed us to purchase that land so cheap and build our, you know, white people superhighways from downtown to the suburbs. It was very intentional and insidious, and unfortunately, like, our government systems these days don't, like, I feel like consciousness is rising, people know that that's wrong, but there's still this resistance to government, like, taking accountability for that awful, you know, those awful policies. And what was very blatantly racism throughout history. So like, I think about terms like historically disadvantaged or historically, even just like historically Black communities is another good identifier. Just to be like, geographically, like racism was built into the land in this area. Economic disadvantage was built into the land for these people in this, you know, in this neighborhood. So, you know, I think the way that I would word it would be to focus on the needs of historically, intentionally disadvantaged communities. That's a lot of adjectives. But that's not to say that people are lesser or thought of as lesser. It's to recognize and take accountability of the fact that historically they were, and that is why the conditions are the way that they are today. And that's what we need to acknowledge and change. I like what Christine said about making sure that voices that are historically, again, left out of the conversation, whether it be intentional or not, I think it's intentional, but to make sure that voices that are historically left out of the conversation are included in the conversation, and are given decision-making power in some way or another. So again, like there's so many different policies and like things that need to change. I was wondering maybe what Ms. White thinks about that language, or like what language makes more sense than like disadvantaged communities, because that is a very like academic and politically correct term for historically Black communities, or you know, the ways that like we group neighborhoods together in order to identify them or plan for them or around them, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Dana. Ms. White, if you have a comment in regards to Dana's remarks, we'd be happy to hear him briefly. I don't know if Ms. White can hear me. I see that she's on but muted. So for the sake of keeping us moving, if she can hear me and decides that she wants to chime in, I'd be happy to take a break at that point in time.
Mr. Chair.
David's camera coming back on. So David, do you have a comment?
Yeah, and Dana, I just like to say about the wording. I see Dana's point in the wording, but at the same time, even though it's a very academic way of categorizing or identifying a community, I think what we want to do is maybe come from a point of empowering the community. Why say disadvantaged when we can say African American? That's why every time I spoke, I referred to the African American community, except for when I was just pointing out a sentence. So I do see both sides. My feedback would be if we can come from a positive or empowering standpoint and just referring to the community as an African American community, as opposed to historically disadvantaged. Great, we get that, but in the resolution, I don't think that's where we need to state it. So that would be my feedback.
Okay, thank you, David. Dana, I'm just going to go back to you briefly, and then I think probably move the discussion a little bit forward on this particular subject. Go ahead, Dana.
That's great feedback, David. That's kind of what I was thinking too. So I just reworded that sentence just to put it out there and see what you guys think. And working towards more robust access to transportation, of all modes of transportation, with a more intentional focus on the needs of historically African American communities in Hillsborough County. Because the idea is to like be intentional about focusing on the needs of historically African American community, or I mean, again, that's also kind of patriarchal again, because it's like, I hear what you're saying, David, about empowering the African American community, and again, back to what Christine said, making sure that people are at the table for decision making. I kind of just contradicted myself, but anyways, that's how I reworded it. The more intentional focus on the needs of historically African American communities in Hillsborough County.
And Dana, I think that's fine.
Awesome.
Hey, Hoyt, it's Christine. May I say something?
Yes, Christine, please go ahead.
Okay, I just want to say that from my perspective, the use of the words disenfranchisement and disadvantaged is kind of a respect or a bow to the white privilege, you know, the opposite of that. In other words, we acknowledge there's been white privilege that results in the land use and transportation decisions that have previously been made, then to kind of, not kind of, but to balance that or acknowledge that is the same by saying, you know, that's why those words like disenfranchisement or disadvantaged were used by me to kind of lay that out there very clearly, that some have been advantaged or privileged while others have not. And so I just wanted to kind of explain that or share the insight from my perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. So with that said, I think it seems like this is going to be an issue where maybe we're going to have a little bit of a vote just on this specific term. And again, to circle back to the beginning of the meeting, given the size of our group, this is not going to be some formal parliamentary procedure to come to a vote on this. But I think I'd like to take a vote amongst the committee members regarding the use specifically of the word disadvantaged, and whether or not that should be included, because obviously I think there's been a sizable amount of debate on it. And so that's maybe one issue we should decide to clear up before moving on. So unless anybody has an objection specifically to voting on that, I would ask that members let me know whether they are yay or nay against using the term disadvantaged.
I say remove, in my opinion, this is David, I say we remove the disadvantage.
And I would add to that, replace it with historically African American.
Correct. Thank you, David.
Thank you.
This is Christine. I vote to remove the word disadvantaged and disenfranchised.
Thank you. Cliff, do you have a vote on this?
I'm indifferent, so either way works.
I'll take your indifferent as a yes for this particular purpose.
Yep.
I will count myself as a yes. I don't think we're missing anybody. That's 4. Am I correct, Rich?
Sorry, I was on mute. So I heard David chime in. I heard Christine. I heard Cliff, and I think Dana was the one who proposed it. And I heard yourself. So I think that's everybody.
Okay, so I think that's 5. I realize this simple math is getting to me here in the evening, but so we all agree as a committee to take out the word disadvantage. Now on that point, I want to circle back a little bit on this line because I know Cliff had raised an objection specifically early on in his comments regarding just limiting it to African Americans. And so I'm wondering, as a committee, do we need to have any discussion at all about broadening it beyond just the African American community? So if anybody'd like to comment at this time, let me know, please. Cliff, I see you've come on the screen, so.
I just reiterate my point that what we do here is a resolution. And back to some of Rich's comments, whereas the CAC has this role, and whereas the violence that's gone on has led us to this point, I'm not trying to wordsmith here. And the fact that the CAC is a recommendation body. We don't make policy, but we recommend to the MPO. So we need to be careful as to stating what we can or can't accomplish. As I said earlier, this resolution will be around for a long time, and the intent of it is to try to influence policy going forward so that all types of communities, all groups of people that may be impacted by transportation decisions, their needs are taken into account. So that's why I'm still in favor of making sure that, or suggesting that we have broad enough language so that it doesn't just focus on, what happened yesterday or just a particular group. It's a blueprint for the future.
Hope, can we add in there disenfranchised?
I believe that's Ms. White speaking. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. So
disenfranchised community.
Okay, so Ms. White proposes we use the word disenfranchised instead of disadvantaged. Does anyone in the committee have any feedback about using the word disenfranchised?
So, Ms. White, this is David. We actually just had that conversation, and the point that I was making is, for this resolution, I think we want to come from a place of power. So when we want to refer to the African American community, we don't want to use words like disadvantaged, disenfranchised. I prefer to say African American community, okay? Just because we want to come from a place of power. So we actually just had that discussion, actually, and we voted to remove the terms or words disadvantaged and disenfranchised. And I was in agreement with that.
Thank you, David. And the reason I just, so I looked at the last votes strictly as regard to the word disadvantaged, and I know some may parse a difference between disadvantaged and disenfranchised. So I just wanted to make sure that we as a committee are all in agreement that disenfranchised as well should not be in the resolution. So if any of the committee members disagrees, raise your objection now, or otherwise I will presume that disenfranchised is subsumed in our vote on the use of the word disadvantaged. Dana, comment?
Yeah, I would like to speak on that. The word disadvantaged is disempowering. I feel that disenfranchised has a different meaning in that it recognizes that people have been systematically not allowed to participate in the process. And I think that's important to recognize. The other thing is, I think that it's important, as David's saying, to specifically call out the Black community, because as I wrote in my rationale, the entirety of America's current wealth, which is disproportionately held by white people, was built on the backs of specifically Africans who were stolen or bought and enslaved. And that is just so important. Honestly, and I've read this again and again, like the African American, or just the African struggle, because a lot of people just want to be called African, or you could just say the Black struggle, is it's its own issue. It's particularly extreme. And that being said, I would propose saying something along the lines of, because I do agree with Cliff that a lot of communities have experienced heinously being ignored, and are at a disadvantage, have been disenfranchised, and experience a lot of issues and quality of life issues and discrimination and all of that. So I would propose saying African American communities and other disenfranchised communities. Because, that's what the best practice actually kind of is to kind of say both and not just say, oh, people of color as just an umbrella term, because while there are intersections, the African struggle is different. It's bigger, it's deeper, it's just we tend to say things like the Black and brown community, or the Black and Latinx community, or the Black in this community, the Black in other communities. which might be kind of a new idea or concept to some people on this call. I hope that I'm explaining it well as to why I would propose that we say the African American community and other disenfranchised communities. And I also prefer the word disenfranchised over disadvantaged because, again, disenfranchised means like specifically like left out of the conversation, not because of anything that they did, if that makes sense.
Mr. Chair?
Thank you, Dana. So in light of that discussion, as I understand it, or Rich, do you need to go ahead?
No, go ahead. I didn't want to stop you. I'll chime in a minute after you.
No, Rich, I think it's probably important for you to go ahead and chime in before I
Yeah, I didn't want to interrupt your flow, but I did want to just mention a couple of things. One is that you know, the MPO has an obligation, and it's really a civil rights obligation to look out for what are known as protected classes, which is essentially you know, folks who are you know, in a racial or an ethnic category. It's very broad, really, and we actually have a non-discrimination plan. I mean, we're planners, so we try to address this systematically in our non-discrimination plan, and it's on our website. It's available if you look for you know, our commitment to non-discrimination. You'll find it there. We are going to be updating that in the next several months, and I'm sure that'll come through the CAC as well as the other committees. So if there's any concern that, you know, we're being too narrow here or focusing exclusively on the African American community, I mean, I don't think that's really going to affect our procedures and practices to try to avoid discriminatory practices that cover a lot of different categories. So that's one thing. I guess the other is I wrote this down. I think the other is that this whole turn of events recently with the protests and the uprising specifically triggered by you know, police brutality, I think has caused a lot of organizations, ourselves included, and I mean Plan Hillsborough, not just the MPO, to kind of go back and re-examine themselves and you know, ask, you know, what could we be doing better? And I think one of the things that we are mulling, I don't think we have specific, I can't give you too much in the way of specifics at this point, but is to do just what Ms. White suggested, which is to try to build some better partnerships throughout the community, but especially within the African American community, and you know, see if there's a way that we can listen more carefully and take their needs and you know, their issues into account when we do our planning. And you know, lest one think that, you know, what we do is unimportant. What we do and what you do is very important because, you know, projects like the interstate don't just happen overnight. They have long lead times. I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but you know, if it's not built into a long range plan, it's not likely to happen. And even if it is built into a long range plan, it's going to take a long time for it to happen. But I guess the bottom line is that if we don't take into account at the front end the needs of the communities that are potentially impacted, you know, we're just going to repeat the the problems and the sins that have been committed in the past. So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying I wouldn't be too concerned about trying to wordsmith this to be overly inclusive. If you want to focus specifically on the African American community, I don't think that's going to hurt it at all. I do agree that with Dana that there's historically disenfranchised communities, and it's not just limited to the African Americans. So, I mean, if that's something you want to build into one of the whereas clauses up front, I think people would get that. But I just wanted to kind of reassure the folks on this call that we're not just going to focus narrowly on one segment of the population. It's just that this one segment of the population, has been overlooked, ignored, and damaged, and now we're dealing with the consequences. So, I think it's highly appropriate and very timely to consider this resolution.
Okay, thank you, Rich, for that feedback. So just as we move forward, I just want to make sure in terms of the use of the word disenfranchised, we have David against, Dana in favor, and then I want to get Christine and Cliff's opinion on that specific word potentially being in before we move forward.
This is Christine, and I'm in favor of the way Dana phrased it. I do like the notion of including the word disenfranchised.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Cliff, I think you're the only outstanding.
I agree.
So that's a yes.
That's a yes.
Okay. I'm gonna the 3 of the 5 puts us at a majority to say that we can include the use of the word disenfranchised. So I thank everybody for their feedback on that particular point. Now, just in terms of some of the whereas clauses, Rich, maybe if you could chime in for a second again. I mean, as I look at the document, this entire thing could be a series of whereas clauses, outside of the, last part about developing action items. I mean, I don't really consider that to be a whereas, but I mean, certainly the first 2 paragraphs, anything we have in there could be considered whereas clauses. Am I barking up the right tree there, Rich?
Yeah, I think so. And I think it was Christine who suggested that maybe it starts off with a sentence about, the role of the CAC the goal of the CAC is to represent the entire community, but recognizing that there have been disenfranchised folks in the past that need to be addressed now. Something along those lines. I think that might be a standalone whereas clause by itself. So that would give you 3 clauses, and then the last would be the resolved part, which would be the last paragraph as I read it.
Okay, thank you, Rich. I see Cliff's screen coming on. Cliff, you're good? Okay. So as I see this, probably the most efficient way in my mind to work through this is for us to go through and just say, whether we agree with the specific changes that Dana and Cliff have made. And then once we have gone through those changes, then I would circle back and say, what additional pieces do we want to add in terms of the discussion about, perhaps a whereas clause at the beginning regarding why the CAC is here, or even a whereas clause regarding perhaps the Central Avenue Business District being removed or something like that. But I look at that as kind of the most efficient way, I think, to move us forward towards more finalized products. So, but before I do that, were there any understanding that we're going to be talking about specific phraseology and things to add, but were there any other topical suggestions or anything like that we needed to address before moving forward on some of the language? All right.
Hoyt, excuse me, Mr. Chairman, this is Christine, and I just want to say that I did get my Wi-Fi back for a moment, and I was able to send just to Dana the introductory sentence I suggested. And since Dana has already gone through a great amount of time to combine both hers and Cliff's remarks, it may be logical for Dana to assume sort of the reading of the document that we have now, so that you could then kind of just section by section get everybody's approval. Does that make sense?
Yes, Christine, as I understand it, and so just for the edification of everybody, the way I look at doing this first before we get into the additional whereas clauses would be to use the mutual screen here that Rich has up for us, just so that everybody can see what we're going through. And I think everybody's seen drafts of these. And so what I'm proposing is just going through and saying we agree or disagree with these substitutions. And then once that's complete and we have kind of that cleaned up, then we're able to go and discuss the whereas clauses and what to put in the whereas clauses. So that's how I view it.
Thank you for explaining that. As I'm not able to be on the web and see the documents, and I also have another commitment, I'm afraid I do have to excuse myself, but I think we're in really good shape. I would guess us to be at around 90% finished. So I just thank you all.
Okay, thank you, Christine. And I'll for your edification, since I know we have some folks on the phone, I will take just go through and read so that everyone can hear, whether they have visual or not here. So I'm sorry, Dana, did you have a comment?
Just a quick question. When you state the proposed change, can I also explain why I proposed the change?
Let's say this. If there's disagreement about the change, then why don't you explain why there's a change? If there's no disagreement, then I think you would just kind of be preaching to the choir, so to speak. Is that fair, or do you think you need to explain regardless?
That makes sense. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dana. So reading off the first sentence, which was an original sentence, which was stricken, and this is, quote, "Racial discrimination remains a far too prevalent experience in American life," end quote. Does anyone have any disagreement with that sentence being stricken from the resolution? Seeing none, that sentence will be stricken from the resolution. The next sentence includes an additional term, and I will identify it. So it begins, quote, "The extreme acts of," the additional term is racist, so it's "the extreme acts of racist violence and excessive force that led to the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and far too many other African Americans." So first of all, this is confusing because there's a strike too. So are we okay with the addition of the word racist for the extreme acts of, quote, racist, end quote, violence and excessive force? Does anyone have an objection to that use of the term racist? Seeing no objection, the term racist will be included. So I will now again be reading the sentence to say, "The extreme acts of racist violence and excessive force that led to the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and far too many other African Americans." And again, here we have a stricken portion. So the stricken portion is, quote, are a reminder that America's original sin must still be eradicated in order for us to achieve a more perfect union, end quote. Does anyone have an objection with that particular phrase being stricken from the resolution? Seeing none, that phrase will be stricken from the resolution. And this quote is an addition. So after I read the particular quote, if we have approval, I will again read the full sentence as changed. So, quote, should signal to all bodies of government that systemic changes are needed, end quote. Does anyone have an objection to that additional phrase being added to the resolution? Seeing none, the first paragraph, as complete and approved, states that the extreme acts of racist violence and excessive force that led to the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and far too many other African Americans should signal to all bodies of government that systemic changes are needed. Moving on to the second paragraph, this particular phrase has been stricken, quote, throughout the course of history, this racial discrimination has found, I'm sorry, someone's chiming in.
Yes, it's
Yes.
just one real quick. I just wanted to offer that, and far too many other African Americans should be a call to action that systematic changes are needed. You know, it's not just a signal, but it's an actual call to action now to make the changes.
I don't have a problem with that. I think it's the same kind of spirit as signal, but yeah, I like it.
I would agree with that as well.
This is Christine. I like that change, and I would further like to see if we could change the word should to must. Must signal.
That's good too.
Okay, I see Cliff has a thumbs up. So Lynn, do you mind just stating it again? I want to make sure I have the words in the right order so I didn't get them confused.
Sure. So after, and far too many other African Americans must be a call to action that systematic changes are needed.
So as I see it, we've deleted some words out there too in terms of the all bodies of government with the way that Lynn is stating it. So as I understand her phrasing, it says must be a call to action that systemic changes are needed. Do we want to keep the use of the word bodies of, or the words bodies of government in? Any feedback?
I would say keep it in.
Whatever you want to do. David, I like your math.
Thank you. I'm at soccer practice. Sorry, guys.
Keep it in.
Yeah, keep it in. I say keep it in.
I agree. Keep it in.
Okay, so let me try then this phrasing. Must signal to all bodies of government that a call to action for systemic changes are needed. Dana.
The way that I'm hearing it is that the racist violence, etc., should be a call to action to all bodies of government that systemic changes are needed. So so you're just replacing the word signal with should be a call to action to all bodies of governments. That's the way I.
And then Christine suggested saying must be a signal. So that's why I got mixed up when I tried to rephrase it again, because she was saying instead of saying should be, she's saying she said must be, which
I missed
that's
that.
up to you guys.
All right, I think we were good with the use of the word must, is my recollection. So just to be clear, unless anyone objects, that last phrase will be changed to, quote, must be a call to action to all bodies of government that systemic changes are needed, end quote.
Yep.
Okay, Very good. Seeing no objections, we'll move on to the second paragraph. The first paragraph has been finalized prior to the whereas additions and changes. Dana, I'm just kind of taking the assumption here that you're keeping track of these changes along with Rich.
I got it.
Okay.
The whole meeting is being recorded, so we're not in danger of missing anything.
I'm glad, Rich. I just want to make sure we didn't get through all this and then don't even remember what we wrote. So without having to go play back the video. So moving to the second paragraph again, this particular sentence has been stricken. Quote, throughout the course of history, this racial discrimination has found its way into transportation, end quote. Does anybody disagree with that sentence being removed? All right.
I was okay with that staying in there, actually, Hoyt.
Okay,
But
so
if I'm the only one, no worries. It's fine.
all right. Well, so we have at least one vote in favor of keeping that sentence in. Anyone else?
Well, I would just explain why I suggested striking it.
Okay.
Kind of as I mentioned earlier, it's because, well, a couple things. So discrimination is something that like one person does against another person. It's kind of like in an instant, like I am discriminating against you, more than like this concept of the fact that like white supremacy is a power dynamic that has been like intentional throughout history. So it's not that racial discrimination found its way into transportation, but rather the way that transportation has been planned throughout American history has intentionally brutalized African American people and communities. So that's why I recommended taking it out, and I would be curious on your thoughts on that, David.
So, I mean, I'm indifferent if it stays in or goes out. But the reason I was saying that I would like to keep it in, when we talk about racial discrimination, you see it as an instance. Well, every planning process or meeting has been an instance in time. So where we disagree, I think, is where he's saying it's one act against another. I think it can be an act against a governing body, against an organization or a group. So that was my reason for keeping it in. Plus, I think it just a good point, a good historical point in this resolution as to where we're coming from and why we're looking to change it again. Or make this change. So that was why I was agreeing to, if people were in agreement, to keeping that in. But either way, I'm fine with.
All right, thank you, David. And just a reminder to everybody, when they're not speaking, to please try to make sure their mute button is on, just to eliminate feedback. And I apologize, I'm not doing a very good job of checking the chat, so I'm just making sure. All right, we don't have any issues in the chat. All right, Cliff, I see you illuminated. Do you have a remark on this?
I'm okay with leaving it in if you take out the word "this," because that tends to refer back to this one, George Floyd, set of acts, as opposed to, a broader perspective. So, if you say throughout the course of history, racial discrimination has found its way into transportation, I think that's a better statement.
I would agree with that.
All right, Dana, I couldn't tell if you were just picking at your hair or you had a remark. Yeah, go ahead briefly.
Yes, I worry about just the accuracy and the spirit of this whole resolution of really taking accountability. Again, I will just say it really, to say that racial discrimination found its way into transportation ignores the history of very intentional policies and yes, discrimination, sure, if that's the word that makes the most sense. So maybe we could reword it to say, throughout the course of history, transportation planning has been rife with racial discrimination or something like that. I hope you guys understand what I'm saying. I really worry about that kind of feeling like we're kind of shrugging off responsibility of the wrongs of the past by just saying that it found its way into transportation.
Has been evident in transportation planning.
That sounds more accurate.
Okay, if no one has an objection, then I will propose then that we keep that particular sentence in with the specific change instead of has found its way to Cliff's point, has been evident in transportation. If everyone's good with that, I will consider that change approved and we'll move on. Everybody good?
Good to go here.
Okay, thank you. So moving on, this next particular sentence was an addition, quote, transportation planning is one of those systems that must change. Governing bodies that plan transportation must recognize how the system has created and perpetuated racial inequities, end quote. Does anyone have an objection to that addition? Seeing none, we will consider that addition added to the resolution. Now, the next sentence has a variety of deletions and additions. So I'm going to try to read this in a way that somewhat makes the point clear while not confusing it with the additions and deletions. So, whether it be requiring African Americans to sit in the back of the bus, purposely using freeways as a quote slum, end quote, that phrase has been deleted, proposed for deletion. Does anyone have an objection to deleting the word slum from the paragraph? Seeing none, the word slum is deleted. Now, this next phrase has been added, and that is the phrase, quote, neighborhood clearing, end quote. So the beginning of the sentence then reads, whether it be requiring African Americans to sit in the back of the bus, purposely using freeways as a neighborhood clearing tool to bulldoze and divide African American. So do we have any objection with the term neighborhood clearing being added? Seeing none, the term neighborhood clearing will be added. Now there's a following switch of words with the deleted word being neighborhoods and the new added word being the term communities, so that the phrase reads, whether it be requiring African Americans to sit in the back of the bus, purposely using freeways as a neighborhood clearing tool to bulldoze and divide African American communities. Does anyone have an objection to that word substitution of communities for neighborhoods? Seeing none, the term.
I'm sorry. Is it bulldoze and divide African American neighborhoods, or is it bulldoze and isolate African American neighborhoods? I'm asking.
It says divide. If I misspoke, I apologize, but it says bulldoze and divide.
Are you saying that you think it should be isolate instead of divide, Lynn?
Yeah, I'm kind of asking if that's what you guys think historically has happened. Is it dividing them? I feel like it was dividing these neighborhoods from the access to the rest of the city, kind of isolating them from jobs and healthcare and healthy food and educational opportunities, as well as buses and other things.
Thank you, Lynn. So the reason, since I wrote this, I'll chime in for once about why I use the word. The reason I use the word divide specifically is because I think in many cases, the freeways were bulldozed right through the middle of the community. I mean, certainly I think there were instances where a freeway was added where perhaps they were trying to block off, similar to the way railroads were often blocked off African American neighborhoods. But my understanding typically is that the freeways were put through the middle of these communities to destroy them, if you will, people would feel more comfortable with that word. But that's why I use the word divide. So if we feel like we need to change the word divide, I'm okay with it. But I don't know that I feel like isolate, in my personal opinion, would be the most accurate term in this particular instance.
That makes
David?
I agree with you, Hoyt. I think divide is the more appropriate word based on historical events. So I would agree with you. I'm sorry about that.
Okay. Unless anyone else has a particular objection, I'm going to move forward, assuming that word still remains. All right. Seeing no objection or hearing no objection. So there is a second use of the term communities, and I think that was just a typo, so I'm going to consider that as removed. And so now I will read the full sentence. It says, whether it be requiring African Americans to sit in the back of the bus, purposely using freeways as a neighborhood clearing tool to bulldoze and divide African American communities, or refusing to have trains, and I think that's where Cliff requested the substitution for transit, come into certain parts of the city for fear that it would allow African Americans and other minorities to easily reach those communities. Our country has time and again used transportation as a tool of freedom for some, but destruction for others. So given that Cliff had requested the switch from trains to transit, does anyone feel particularly, I think I'm inclined to change it to transit, but I want to get everybody else's feedback here.
I like transit. I also had another suggestion, but I'll save that till the end.
Okay, thank you, Dana. All right. Seeing no objection to the insertion of the word transit, the word trains in that sentence will be changed to transit. So again, I will read the full sentence now. Hopefully we've got it fully revised. Whether it be requiring African Americans to sit in the back of the bus, purposely using freeways as a neighborhood clearing tool to bulldoze and divide African American communities, or refusing to have transit come into certain parts of the city for fear that it would allow African Americans and other minorities to easily reach those communities. Our country has time and again used transportation as a tool of freedom for some, but destruction for others. Yes, Dana.
How do folks feel about, and this is based on the earlier parts of today's conversation, adding in there where it says purposefully using freeways and then adding like I-275 and I-4 as a neighborhood clearing tool to bulldoze and divide? Yeah.
So, Dana, let me know what you think about this suggestion. I think maybe the way to handle this would be for us to get through these particular changes and then circle back. And the reason I'm saying circle back is because I think your discussion on I-275 and I-4 specifically has some merit with the discussion that's been had regarding the Central Avenue Business District and just some of the local touches maybe that we want to add into the resolution. So if you're okay with it, I think I'd like to circle back to that. If you feel strongly about it, I think we could debate adding it here, but I'm just, for organizational purposes, that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, that's fine.
Just, Holt, can I just add something in here, just food for thought?
Yes, recognizing Ms. White, please go ahead.
Okay, just for food for thought, perhaps adding the word box in, because that's what's going to happen with Florabraska and 40th Street. And the only exit that will be left open is into Ybor City. I-4 and 75, 275, whatever that is, Florabraska. Those are the plans right now. It's going to be like Miami, boxing in the African American community with the high walls where you can't see the community.
Okay, thank you, Ms. White. I have written that down, and we will discuss that with the Dana's discussion in the Central Avenue Business District upon kind of getting through the rest of the resolution.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Mr. Clarendon.
Just as a point of information, to Ms. White's comment about Florabraska, originally, she is correct. Originally, Florabraska was proposed to be closed by the Florida DOT as part of their project for the downtown interchange. However, they've backed off that now, and it's the latest plan, and what they're proposing to go forward with is to keep that open. So I just wanted to make that point.
Yeah, thank you, Rick. But they also keep in mind they've already bought up a lot of that property along where they were going to, which was the Black community.
Sure, I understand.
All right. Thank you, Rich, for that clarification. And I think just based on some of Dana's earlier remarks regarding the 40th Street exit, I think a discussion about the boxing in with freeways may be warranted during the additional whereas time. And also, I noticed and note that it's 7:02 p.m. And so I think if we can, and obviously if we need to go longer, we will. But I would just maybe tentatively shoot for a 7:30 cap for everybody. That puts us at 2 hours and an hour over the planned time. So just putting that out there as a note for everybody. Moving on to the next paragraph, which is the final paragraph. So there is an addition and there's a subtraction. And the addition is the word, the phrase, quote, racial justice, end quote. And the deletion would be the phrase, quote, a more equal society that is free from racial discrimination, end quote. So with the proposed addition, the sentence would read, we, the Hillsborough Metropolitan Planning Organization Citizens Advisory Committee, stand with those who peacefully protest for racial justice, period. Does anyone have an objection to the addition of the words racial justice and the deletion of the phrase a more equal society that is free from racial discrimination? All right, seeing no objection, the term racial justice will be added and the phrase a more equal society that is free from racial discrimination will be deleted. Moving on to the next sentence. And again, there is a addition with a particular deletion. So the addition is, quote, with a more intentional focus on the needs of historically disenfranchised communities in, end quote. The deletion is, quote, for all communities in all areas of, end quote. So to read the sentence with the proposed change, the sentence would state, in the area of transportation, we support ending racial discrimination in transportation, which includes ensuring more robust access of transportation to all modes of transportation with a more intentional focus on the needs of historically disenfranchised communities in Hillsborough County, period. Does anyone have an objection to substituting, quote, with a more intentional focus on the needs of historically disenfranchised communities in, end quote, and removing, quote, for all communities in all areas of, end quote? David, you have popped on the screen.
Yep, and as I mentioned before, I don't have a problem with the addition. I would probably just change the word disadvantage to African American community.
Okay, so as I read it, and it may not have been clear, I was using the phrase disenfranchised.
I'm sorry, disenfranchised.
And so David proposes adding in the specific term African American there. So it would say with a more intentional focus on the needs of African American and other historically disenfranchised communities. Does anyone have an objection with the phrase African American being added? All right, seeing none, I'm going to restate the sentence with the additions as approved. Quote, in the area of transportation, we support ending racial discrimination in transportation, which includes ensuring more robust access of transportation to all modes of transportation with a more intentional focus on the needs of African American and historically disenfranchised communities in Hillsborough County, period. Okay, moving on, the last sentence is the same. So very good. Rich, I know you're keeping track of changes. So we've gone through all of Cliff and Dana's proposed changes. And so at this time, I'd like to move to the discussion of whereas clauses and circle back to Dana's specific request about an addition to paragraph number 2, I believe. Dana?
So based on our conversation since 5:30 this afternoon, I took some notes and I had been making some edits. It's not many, but it's more than just the one that I mentioned. I'm sorry about that. So that includes the addition of like I-275 and I-4 in the sentence that says purposefully using freeways as a neighborhood clearing tool. So it would say purposely using freeways like I-275 and I-4 as a neighborhood clearing tool. And then the addition of, I don't know, do we want to do them one at a time? I don't know.
I think it's probably better to do them one at a time because I think just with the volume of changes we've made, and I realize some folks are not visually seeing it and they're just relying on the spoken word, I think it'd be easier to try to do this one at a time. So your proposed change is in the paragraph number 2 when we're talking about purposely using freeways as a neighborhood clearing tool. Your requested language is to basically say purposely using freeways, comma, such as I-275 and I-4, comma, as a neighborhood clearing tool to bulldoze African American communities. Is that how I understand your proposed change?
Yes.
Okay. Now, just as an overall comment, this is a pretty long sentence. So, Dana, just to throw this out here is a possible proposal. Do we want to maybe add an additional sentence at the end instead that maybe just says locally this has been manifested or something along those lines by the building of I-275 and I-4? I'm just kind of thinking out loud here. I'm fine with adding in it in the original sentence, but that was just my concern.
Maybe where the sentence begins, that says whether it be requiring African Americans to sit in the back of a bus, maybe turning that into the next whereas to state whereas locally. Well, no, that doesn't really read well. I don't know.
Well, I tell you what, I'll read the sentence with the addition and we'll just get everybody's thoughts on it with your original addition as proposed. So whether it be requiring African Americans to sit in the back of a bus, purposely using freeways such as I-275 and I-4 as a neighborhood clearing tool to bulldoze and divide African American communities, or refusing to have trains come into certain parts of the city for fear that it would allow African Americans and other minorities to easily reach those communities. Our country has time and again used transportation as a tool of freedom for some, but destruction for others. How do we feel about that particular sentence as amended?
Well, that whole paragraph is all speaking to the exact same point. I mean, that the first sentence says Whereas throughout the course of history, racial discrimination has been evident in transportation planning. And transportation planning is one of those systems that must change. And then we're basically just listing them, like listing the racial discrimination that has been evident in transportation planning.
Right.
And
so, I mean,
I feel like it goes together.
Oh, I'm sorry. So as I envision kind of where the whereas is going, it's going to be whereas transportation planning, et cetera, whereas whether it be requiring African Americans in that whole sentence. So my thought is after that sentence, right, because I don't know how we felt about the inclusion of that particular word and the length of it, we could add a whereas at the end of this particular paragraph to say, whereas locally, I'm trying to think about how to say this. Whereas locally, previous planners, I can't think of a good one out loud, but basically I'm trying to take what that long sentence is and we're talking about in the abstract and basically tie it in and say, you know, whereas locally I-275 and I-4 divided the African-American community in Tampa and destroyed the Central Avenue Business District. That's kind of that was my thought.
It just clicked, and now I understand what you're saying, and I agree with that. At the same time, we should state very plainly that this is just an example because there are too many to actually list. But I see what you're saying, and I agree. That sounds good.
Okay, Cliff, you got your mic on, your hands at the back of your head. You have a comment?
Yes, just one concern, the word purposefully. While I understand the intent of it, if I were sitting on the Transportation Planning Committee and somebody said, you purposefully put the highway through this community to destroy it, I might take offense at that. So just, it's a kind of a strong word. As a committee member, I would come back and say, but I had no other choice. There was no place else to put it, give a whole bunch of reasons. I just throw it out there for consideration.
Thank you, Cliff. As I look at the use of the word purposefully there, I look at it as a historical term, not the current planner's term. Is that how you understand it? Are you looking at it as a current thing or a historical term?
Historically, but if someone who helped build this 10 years ago is still sitting there, are they going to take offense or are they gone? So it's a non-issue. That's
okay.
If they intentionally did something that was racist, then why are we afraid of offending them?
My argument is that they didn't do it on purpose. That they made a set of informed decisions, and this was the best of several bad choices. Again, just sensitivity as opposed to being concerned that we're going to tick somebody off.
Okay, thank you, Cliff. David, your camera's on. Do you have a comment?
Yeah, I would probably say to leave purposefully in. I get your point, Cliff. Sorry about that. I get your point, Cliff. But I think when we look at kind of how things were done historically, I think there is the intent to divide the community, which is what we're saying in a later paragraph. So I would say we leave that in, even though I do understand where you're coming from, Cliff, but I think it was done purposely.
Okay, I made the point. I'm fine.
All right, thank you, David and Cliff. And just for context, when I drafted the word purposely, I envisioned the 50s and 60s style use of the road clearing before MPOs. And for those of you familiar with Robert Moses, that's often the individual I associate with using freeways and roads to divide and bulldoze African-American communities. So we'll leave the term purposefully in. So I'm going to read this sentence again with the addition of the I-275 and I-4. so that we can come to an agreement on it. It says, whether it be requiring African Americans to sit in the back of the bus, purposefully using freeways such as I-275 and I-4 as a neighborhood clearing tool to bulldoze and divide African American communities, or refusing to have trains come into certain parts of the city for fear that it would allow African Americans and other minorities to easily reach those communities. Our country has time and again used transportation as a tool of freedom for some, but destruction for others. Does anyone have a objection to that?
You just, the word trains was substituted with transit.
I apologize, Cliff. You are correct. It should say transit. I just don't have the updated version in front of me.
Otherwise, good.
All right. Dana, you...
Yeah, I'm in support actually of your suggestion to create a new whereas below that. And just instead of saying like I-275 and I-4 in this context, which is more general, creating a more local whereas underneath. I think that's better.
Okay. So since this is your suggestion, then
I rescind.
we'll leave the last sentence as it was originally approved prior to this discussion. And so after where it says as a tool of freedom for some but destruction for others, we'll then have another phrase. And Dana, if you want to propose the language. I mean, I think what I said was whereas locally I-275 and I-4 were used to divide the African-American community in Tampa and destroy the African-American business district on Central Avenue or something to that effect.
Whereas locally I-275 and I-4 were built over African-American communities, and transportation decisions continue, because now we're getting into the present, holding present people accountable for, I mean, it's not necessarily purposeful, but it's definitely a lack of like caring or something, like to continue to, as Andrea said, like continue to box these communities in, take away their exits and their on-ramps, and they're cutting their bus routes and all these things. I mean, there's just a lot that continues to go on today. So whereas locally I-275 and I-4 were built over African-American communities, and transportation decisions continue to exacerbate racial inequity or something.
Let me just think about this.
Oh, wait, I actually kind of like your language, especially as it relates to the divide. Just using that whereas, your whereas statement, I think was fine. That's just me.
Cliff, any comment?
No. I'm okay.
Okay. So I think my proposal was to say, whereas locally I-275 and I-4 were used to divide the African-American community and eliminate the African-American business district on Central Avenue. So that would be my proposed wording roughly. Dana, do you want to give your proposed wording?
Yeah, because the African-American communities were divided or totally eliminated, but the highways weren't used to do that. Like, they were used to do that, but the other like big issue is that they were taking advantage of this racist idea that African-American communities were slums to like buy cheap land. Like, racism allowed these highways to be built in the first place. Sorry, I'm thinking too deep about it. I think the wording is fine. I'm trying to think of, though, just to say like whereas locally, because there's just so many. Okay.
Well,
I think it's fine.
I mean, we could phrase it as whereas locally, this neighborhood clearing was manifested in the construction of I-275 and I-4, which divided the African American community in Tampa and destroyed the Central Avenue Business District.
Whereas locally, neighborhood.
Whereas locally, this neighborhood clearing was manifested in the building of I-275 and I-4, which divided the African American community in Tampa and destroyed the Central Avenue Business District.
Okay, that sounds okay.
All right. Well, what does everybody else think about that?
Cliff's okay.
I think it's fine.
Okay. Rich, do you have because I've said it now, do you have the last thing I said in terms of the phraseology, or do I have to come up with it?
Well, what I wrote down was, whereas locally, this neighborhood clearing was manifested in the building of I-270 and I-275 and I-4, and the destruction of the Central Avenue business district.
Yeah.
I wrote it down.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Dana.
I wrote it down. He had half of it. Whereas locally, neighborhood clearing was manifested in the construction of I-275 and I-4, which were used to divide African American communities and eliminate the African American business district on Central Business District Central on Central Avenue.
I think at the last phrase I didn't say African American. I just said the Central Avenue Business District.
It was that the African American business and eliminate. Okay, so just say and eliminate the Central Avenue Business District. Okay.
Yeah, because I think it communicates. We don't need to add double African American twice in that. I think is what I was thinking the last read through. So, okay. Do you want to just read it back one more time, if you would, please?
Yes. Whereas locally, neighborhood clearing was manifested in the construction of I-275 and I-4, which were used to divide African American communities and eliminate the Central Avenue Business District.
Okay, thank you, Dana. Does anyone object to that language, or are we okay with that language? Okay, seeing no objection, that language has been approved at the end of the second paragraph, although I don't know if these will end up being paragraphs when all the whereases get in. One other change that was noted was the addition at the beginning of the goal of the CAC, which I know Christine had discussed and others had discussed. Dana, comment?
I wrote down what she suggested. Do you want me to read it?
Yes, if you would, please.
So the first clause would state, whereas the purpose of the Citizens Advisory Committee to the Metropolitan Planning Organization is to ensure all voices in the community are represented during transportation planning decisions.
And by the way, Dana was kind enough to put that in the chat box.
Very good. Okay. So does anyone have an objection to that language being added at the beginning of the resolution?
I think it's great.
I agree, Cliff. David?
Works for me.
Okay, Dana's smiling, so I'm going to take that as a yes vote on her side. So unless anyone objects to that phrase being added and at the very beginning as a whereas clause, seeing no objection, the phrase will be added. So Do we have any other suggested edits or additions? I know we're kind of pushing up close to 7:30 and have covered quite a lot. Yes, Dana, please go ahead.
Thank you so much. I wanted to add Andrea's suggestion in the now third paragraph with the last addition, where she wanted to say and box in African American communities. And I know we're lengthening this long sentence again, but I just think that we should add, you know, this person from the community. I think she has a good point, and we should add it just so she knows we were listening. So then the sentence would read, whether it be requiring African Americans to sit in the back of a bus, purposefully using freeways as a neighborhood clearing tool to bulldoze, divide, and box in African American communities, or refusing to have transit come to certain parts of the city, etc. So just the addition of and box in.
Okay, thank you, Dana. Does anyone have an objection to the addition of the word box in that particular sentence?
Nope.
Cliff?
Nope.
Cliff approves. All right. Unless there's objection, seeing no objection, the phrase box in will be added. So the sentence will now read, whether it be requiring African American communities to sit in the back of a bus, purposely using freeways as a neighborhood clearing tool to bulldoze, divide, and box in African American communities, or refusing to have transit come into certain parts of the city for fear that it would allow African Americans and other minorities to easily reach those communities. Our country has time and again used transportation as a tool of freedom for some, but destruction for others. Okay. Are there any other additional proposed changes from any members of the committee? Dana.
Two things in the last, and they're both in the last paragraph. The sentence that says, in the area of transportation, I think we should just add the word planning. In the area of transportation planning. I just feel like transportation is like vague and weird. I don't know. But like specifically, we need to change how we plan transportation. Maybe actually not.
Yeah, I think it's more accurate. That's
I
what
agree.
More actionable.
Okay, so the proposed change in this sentence would now read, quote, in the area of transportation planning, we support ending racial discrimination in transportation, which includes ensuring more robust access of transportation in all modes of transportation with a more intentional focus on the needs of the historically disenfranchised communities in Hillsborough County. Does anyone object to the addition of the word planning in that sentence? Seeing no objection, the word planning will be added.
And now I have
Yes, Dana, go ahead.
a couple other suggestions for that sentence, which I feel like maybe some of you probably noticed, is that now it says in transportation twice. I think that it should state, in the area of transportation planning, we support ending racial discrimination, and remove that second in transportation.
Okay, does anyone have an objection to removing the second or use of the word transportation in that sentence? I'll read the full sentence again. In the area of transportation planning, we support ending racial discrimination, which includes ensuring more robust access of transportation to all modes of transportation with a more intentional focus on the needs of historically disenfranchised communities in Hillsborough County.
I want to edit that, actually.
Yeah, too many transportations, but keep going. You're doing good.
I think, okay, we're getting there. Let's just start with the word we. So take out in the area of transportation planning and instead say, we support ending racial discrimination in transportation planning, which includes. Does that make sense?
Okay, so the proposed change would now have the sentence read, we support ending racial discrimination in transportation planning, which includes ensuring more robust access of transportation to all modes of transportation with a more intentional focus on the needs of historically disenfranchised communities in Hillsborough County. Anyone have an objection to that change? Okay, seeing none or hearing none, the sentence has now been amended to state, quote, we support ending racial discrimination in transportation planning, which includes ensuring more robust access of transportation to all modes of transportation with a more intentional focus on the needs of historically disenfranchised communities in Hillsborough County. Are there any other recommended changes or suggested edits to the resolution at this time? Okay, seeing none, does the committee vote to approve the resolution as amended to send to the full Citizens Advisory Committee for a vote that would then send it on to the MPO board?
Hey, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Mr. Clarendon.
Just one change I think is going to be necessary. So it refers to June 10th. I think you're just going to have to leave that blank. Or if you'd like, you can put in the next meeting date, which I think is August 12th.
I think just putting in August 12th is appropriate now. Thank you, Rich, for that well caught point of change. I don't think anybody objects to changing the date until to August 12th, which is the new meeting date. Okay, very good. Seeing no objection, it'll be changed to August 12th. All right, so I think that concludes our time this evening now that we have edited and approved the resolution. Rich or Dana, if you have the draft, you can send to Rich. Rich, if you don't mind, maybe just sending it around to the subcommittee at some point. Doesn't have to be today, just to make sure we can all visualize it, because I know this has been quite a bit of edits, but otherwise I think everyone did a good job today, and appreciate everyone's input and spending the extra hour, which it seems we do very well at these meetings of the Citizens Advisory Committee. So without any further input or needed action items, this meeting of the Subcommittee on Racial Justice and Inequities is concluded.
Thank you.
Thank you.